The transmission arrived in silence. That was the first thing the archivists of the conclave would note years later when they combed through every record of that period looking for the moment things changed. Not a broadcast, not a distress signal, not the coordinated response of a civilization marshaling its resources in answer to a galaxy-wide plea. Just silence on every frequency for 11 hours, and then fire. Counselor Vane Sarrett had been awake for 36 hours when the preliminary reports landed on her desk. She was a Drassian, a species that measured exhaustion differently than most, whose biology permitted a kind of cognitive compression that allowed complex processing even in states of deep fatigue, and yet the documents in front of her made her feel something she could not physiologically explain. Her secondary hearts, the ones that governed emotional response rather than circulatory function, were beating out of rhythm. She read the report a second time, then a third. The numbers didn't change. The humans had committed 41% of their entire defensive fleet to a system they had no territorial claim to. A system that, by every strategic calculation the Conclave's war modeling intelligences had run, was already lost. The Veth advance had consumed the outer belt stations in less than a rotation. The colony infrastructure on the third planet had been destroyed. The Halen refugees, a species with no meaningful military tradition, no weaponized technology, and a biological vulnerability to vacuum exposure that made evacuation protocols nearly impossible, had been given a 6% survival probability by the Conclave's own assessment. 6%, and yet the humans had answered. Not with a measured response force, not with a token gesture of solidarity that could be later cited in diplomatic proceedings, not with the careful, negotiated, mutually beneficial exchange of military assets that every other conclave member had offered or declined to offer, each with their own perfectly reasonable strategic justification. The humans had answered with everything. Vane Sarrett pulled up the secondary report. The one the Fleet Intelligence Division had flagged as requiring senior review, marked with the designation that translated loosely as anomalous behavioral data requiring contextual interpretation. She had learned in her years on the Conclave that when Fleet Intelligence used the word anomalous in connection with humans, what they actually meant was something closer to "we don't have a category for this." The human ships had entered the Halen system already firing, not tactically. Not in coordinated suppression patterns designed to establish a defensive perimeter. They had entered at velocities the Veth had not anticipated because the Veth's own modeling systems, like the Conclave's, had made the foundational assumption that any fleet committed to a rescue operation would prioritize the survival of the rescuing force. Standard doctrine across 14 spacefaring civilizations held that you did not save anyone by destroying yourself. The humans had apparently not received that particular piece of wisdom. Or Vane Sarrett thought, pressing two fingers against the bridge of her cranial ridge in a gesture her species used when processing something deeply uncomfortable, or they had received it, understood it completely, and decided it was irrelevant. Commander Yale Droz had not slept in 40 hours when her ship, the Amaranth's Edge, crossed into Halen space. She was aware of this fact the way a person is aware of a splinter, present, irritating, not currently the most important thing happening. The tactical display was showing her things that her hindbrain was trying to refuse. The Veth were not a species she had studied extensively. Before the crisis, most of humanity had not. They were a conclave member, a peripheral one granted, with a complicated history of territorial disputes that the conclave's diplomatic architecture had spent 60 years managing into something resembling stability. But they were not traditionally considered a military threat in the class of species that humanity's defense planners spent their long nights worrying about. They were methodical, patient, efficient in the way of something that had never needed to be anything else. They consumed territory the way certain geological processes consumed coastlines, inexorably without visible urgency, in ways that only became catastrophic when you looked at the scale of change across time rather than moment to moment. The Halen had not understood what was happening to them until their outer stations were already gone. Yale understood it now, looking at the tactical display. The Veth had not launched a military strike. They had launched an erasure. The distinction was not academic. "Weapons officer," she said. Her voice was very calm. She had been told once by a Drassian diplomatic liaison who had observed a human briefing that humans became quieter as the stakes increased and that this was, from the outside, extremely unnerving. She had thought that was a strange thing for an alien to find unnerving. She thought about it now and understood it a little better. "Commander, I want every long-range asset we have targeting the Veth command cluster, not the advanced ships." "The command cluster?" A pause. "That's, Commander, the command cluster is inside the debris field from the third planets. I know where it is." Another pause, shorter this time. Lieutenant Commander Iris had served with her for 4 years. He understood certain things about her that did not appear in her service record. "Yes, Commander." She turned back to the display. On the third planet's surface, What remained of the surface, where the colony infrastructure had been systematically stripped rather than explosively destroyed, because the Veth did not waste, there were still Halen survivors. The colony's emergency protocols had moved several thousand of them into subsurface shelters designed for geological events, not military ones. The shelters were holding, for now. The Veth had not yet turned their attention to the subsurface layer. Either they didn't know, or they hadn't decided whether it was worth the resource expenditure. 6% survival probability. Yale had read that assessment. She had read it the same way she read the fuel consumption projections that said the Amaranth's Edge had approximately 14 hours of sustained combat operations before critical systems began failing. The same way she had read the Conclave's formal declaration that intervention in the Halen system was strategically inadvisable given the current probability matrices. She had a relationship with probability matrices. It was not a warm one. "Contact Admiral Messon on the Undying Promise," she said. "Tell him we're hitting the command cluster in 4 minutes and I'd appreciate fire support on the eastern approach vectors." Phrased exactly like that. The communications officer, a young man named Okafor who had been with the Amaranth's Edge for less than 6 months and was currently learning in real time exactly what kind of operation he had signed up for, looked up with an expression that landed somewhere between professional composure and existential recalibration. "Phrased exactly like that, Commander. He'll know what I mean." What Admiral Messon knew, and what he had known since the moment the deployment orders came through, was that this was not a mission with a clean exit. He had not said this to his crew. He had said other things that were true, that were relevant, that needed to be said, but not that particular true and relevant thing. There was a calculation in that omission that he had turned over in his mind several times during the approach transit. Examining it from different angles the way you examine something you're not sure is structurally sound before you put your weight on it. He was 53 years old. He had gray at his temples and a scar along his left jaw from an incident in a debris field 8 years ago that he rarely thought about and never talked about. He had 2 daughters. He had made a decision in a briefing room 12 hours ago that had been technically voluntary. The deployment orders carried a formal opt-out provision, because humanity's military doctrine included one in cases of this classification, and he had not opted out, and neither had any of the 41% of the fleet that had followed him here. He thought about that sometimes. The opt-out provision. How many of the Conclave's member civilizations assumed that the humans had simply not been offered one? The Undying Promise was the largest ship in the formation. This meant tactically that it was the largest target. Messon had made a number of observations over the course of his career about the relationship between size and targeting priority in fleet engagements, and all of them were present in his mind, as the first Veth response units began repositioning. He opened the channel to Commander Droz. "I got your message," he said. "Admiral, 4 minutes, give or take." He looked at his tactical display, he looked at the debris field, he looked at what the Veth command cluster's position inside that debris field implied about the approach vectors available to him. "You know," he said, "when I was young there was a saying, something about not throwing good money after bad. I've heard it, I've been thinking about it." A brief silence, and the Halen don't have money," he said. "They have children in underground shelters and approximately 9 hours of oxygen left in the emergency systems. So, Yale agreed. "Fire support on the eastern approach, 4 minutes." He paused. "Yale, sir, make it mean something." The channel closed. Messon turned to his bridge crew, who had heard exactly enough of that conversation to understand the full shape of the situation they were in, and who were to a person already at their stations doing their jobs with the quiet intensity of people who had also made a calculation about the opt-out provision and reached the same answer he had. He felt something he didn't have a precise word for. It wasn't pride. Pride implied a distance, an elevation above the thing you were proud of. It was closer to recognition. The particular recognition of seeing something you already knew to be true confirmed in the behavior of people you had chosen to stand next to. "All stations," he said. "Battle readiness." The Veth commander, whose designation translated approximately as precision of form in silence, had been in military command for decades. The Veth measured military experience differently than most species. Not an engagement survived, but in outcomes achieved, because the underlying philosophy held that survival without achieving the mission objective was a form of failure that simply hadn't been formally categorized yet. By this metric, precision of form in silence was extraordinarily experienced. She had not anticipated the humans. This was not technically a failure of intelligence. The humans had been assessed. Their fleet strength was known. Their strategic doctrine was documented. Their prior military interventions had been cataloged and analyzed by the Veth Strategic Intelligence Division, which was, by any reasonable standard, among the most sophisticated such operations in the Conclave. What the Intelligence Division had failed to account for What no one had failed to account for because it had never needed to be accounted for was that human strategic doctrine appeared to have a gap in it. Specifically, the gap between the doctrine and the behavior. Every spacefaring civilization in the conclave operated according to a fundamental principle that was so foundational it was rarely articulated explicitly, in the same way that the existence of vacuum is rarely articulated explicitly in a discussion of spacecraft hull integrity. The principle was this: a civilization's military assets represented that civilization's survival capacity. Survival capacity was not expendable. Therefore, military assets were not expendable beyond the threshold at which their expenditure threatened the civilization's ability to continue functioning. There was a word for civilizations that violated this principle. The word translated approximately as extinct. The humans were behaving as though this principle did not apply to them, not recklessly, not through ignorance. Precision of form and silence, watching the tactical readouts as the human formation completed its approach, felt something she identified after a moment as the specific discomfort of seeing something familiar behave in a fundamentally unfamiliar way. The humans were operating with clear tactical awareness. Their formation was coherent. Their targeting was precise. Their communications discipline was, by the readings her systems were capturing, exceptional. They simply appeared to have decided that the cost-benefit analysis that governed every other civilization's decision-making was not the analysis they were running. She opened a channel to her strategic division. What is the human fleet's projected survival capacity at current engagement parameters? The answer came back in seconds. Approximately 62% casualties within 8 hours, 79% within 12, and their assessment of this probability, a pause, unknown. Our best modeling suggests they have access to similar data. Then why? Precision of form and silence said, and she heard something strange in her own voice, something that the Veth did not have an exact emotional category for but that functioned similarly to what other species experienced as a slow and gathering dread. Why are they still accelerating toward us? No one on her command deck answered, because there was no answer that fit within the framework they were using. And none of them yet understood that the framework was the problem. Yale's first ship took a hit at the 3-hour mark. Not the Amaranth's Edge, the Castellan, one of the fast attack vessels on her left flank, piloted by a crew she had trained with and argued with and shared meals with over the course of 18 months. The hit was catastrophic in the way that hits to ships of that class are catastrophic when they land wrong, which is to say that the Castellan was there, and then it wasn't, and the tactical display updated with the particular cold efficiency that tactical displays have when they are removing something from the board. Yale noted it. She continued working. This was not callousness. The people who would later analyze her psychological profile, and there would be people who did this extensively, because what happened in the Haaland system produced a documentation archive that several civilizations would spend decades trying to fully process, would be careful to note that it was not callousness. The psychological literature on human combat cognition made a distinction, which many non-human analysts found difficult to internalize, between not feeling something and continuing to function while feeling it. The two states looked identical from the outside. They were not identical. She felt the loss of the Castellan the way she felt the splinter of exhaustion, present, real, not currently the most important thing. She was aware that she would feel it more completely later, and she was aware that later depended entirely on there being a later, and she moved on. The Veth command cluster was moving. That was new. In everything the Conclave's intelligence had on the Veth, command clusters did not maneuver during active operations. They were fire direction assets, not combat vessels, heavily shielded, heavily armed in the defensive sense, positioned to coordinate rather than to fight. The movement was subtle. A repositioning inside the debris field, using the remains of what had once been the third planet's largest orbital station as additional cover. Yale watched it on the display and understood immediately what it meant. They were scared. She had never in her career heard anyone describe a Veth command action as being driven by fear. The Veth did not fear. They calculated, they assessed, they processed. These were the words that showed up in every piece of intelligence documentation she had ever read about them. But the command cluster was moving, and it was moving in a way that only made sense if the entity directing it had updated its threat assessment in a way that the original positioning had not accounted for. She keyed the channel to Messin. "Admiral, the command cluster is repositioning. I see it. I think they're recalculating us. A beat. What does that tell you?" She thought about it. The command cluster was moving deeper into the debris field, away from the engagement. Away from the geometry that allowed clean targeting solutions. "It tells me they're running the same probability matrices they always run," she said, "and the output is something they haven't seen before, because the input is something they haven't seen before." "Yes," another beat. "So let's make sure they see enough of it to keep recalculating," Messin said. "Keep pressure on the eastern approach, don't let them settle." She cut the channel and looked at the tactical display. The Amaranth's Edge had a weapons officer who had once said in a quiet moment that the thing about humans in a fight was that they got comfortable in discomfort. That they had a threshold, not of pain, not of fear, but of normalization, at which point the situation they were in, however terrible, became the situation they were working within rather than the situation they were reacting to. He had said this as if it were simply an observation. Looking back, she thought he had been trying to explain something that he understood intuitively but couldn't quite articulate. She thought she understood it now. Weapons, she said, everything we have, target the debris field geometry, not the cluster directly. I want to close off the repositioning options. Commander, if we fire into the debris field at that density, there's significant risk of, I know, a pause. Yes, Commander. What the Conclave's real-time monitoring systems recorded, and what would later be replayed in approximately 400 separate policy discussions, diplomatic proceedings, military strategy reviews, and one very long philosophical symposium hosted by the Drassian Institute for Behavioral Science, was the following sequence. At hour 4, the human fleet sustained casualties approaching 30%. At hour 4.5, the human fleet sustained casualties approaching 38%. At hour 5, the Veth Command Cluster, which had repositioned twice, issued a formal communication to the human fleet commander demanding to know the terms under which the humans would accept withdrawal. The response arrived 17 seconds later. In the Conclave's translation matrix, it rendered as, "We won't." At hour 5.5, the human fleet, now operating at approximately 60% effective capacity, made a tactical decision that the Veth Strategic Intelligence Division would later describe, in their formal after-action report, as inconsistent with the survival-preservation imperative inherent to rational military actors. They split. Half the remaining force drove directly into the engagement zone at maximum velocity. The other half, the slower vessels, the damaged ones, the ones whose combat effectiveness had been most severely degraded, repositioned toward the third planet. The Veth, whose Strategic Intelligence Division was very good at its job, immediately understood the second half. The slower ships were covering an evacuation. The Veth had known about the subsurface shelters. They had not prioritized them because the evacuation of several thousand Halan from an underground shelter was, by any rational calculation, not a viable military objective given the vacuum exposure problem and the available transport capacity. It took the Veth Strategic Intelligence Division an additional 47 seconds to understand the first half. The faster ships, the combat-effective ones, the ones that could have covered the evacuation and maybe in some outcomes made it out of the system with a survivable casualty count, were not covering the evacuation. They were drawing fire, deliberately, aggressively, with a focus that the tactical readouts described as maximum engagement pressure, which was the clinical term for what happened when a force decided to make itself the most threatening thing in the vicinity, and sustain that decision regardless of what it cost. They were buying time, not for themselves, for the slower ships pulling Halan survivors out of underground shelters on a planet whose surface was 40% degraded, and whose atmospheric processors were failing. The Veth Command Cluster issued a second communication. This one was not addressed to the human fleet commander. It was addressed to the Conclave monitoring station in the adjacent system, and its contents translated and archived read as follows: Request immediate strategic consultation. Current engagement parameters do not conform to any modeled human behavioral profile. Require updated threat assessment. Urgent. The Conclave monitoring station, staffed by a Drassian analyst named Vane Sarat who had not slept in nearly 60 hours, and who had been watching the tactical feeds with an expression her colleagues would later describe as progressive destabilization, received this message and sat with it for a long moment. Then she opened her personal log and recorded a single observation in her species notation system that translated as, "They are not fighting to win. They are fighting to continue." I do not know if we have a category for what happens when those two things are not the same. Yale Droz took a fragment hit at hour 6. It was not the worst injury she had sustained in her career. It was objectively a significant injury, her left side, from a debris impact during a close-range exchange that her maneuvering had minimized but not entirely avoided, and it produced a volume of blood that her bridge crew found alarming, and that she found inconvenient. The ship's medical system wanted her in the trauma bay. She instructed it, via the interface on her command chair, to note her refusal and continue with its secondary functions. The ship's medical system complied, because it was a system and it did what it was instructed to do, but the medical officer, a woman named Dr. Ade who had approximately 46 different opinions about the situation and was exercising the professional discipline not to share most of them, came to the bridge personally and did what she could at the command station. "You need to stop moving," Dr. Ade said. "In approximately 2 hours," Yale said. one way or another. Dr. Ades said something under her breath that was not in any known language, which was her habit when she felt strongly about something and was choosing not to formally express it. She worked quickly and efficiently, and Yale felt the injury recede to a manageable background reality, present and noted and not currently the most important thing. The Halen transports, Yale said to her comms officer. Third extraction wave just cleared the surface, Commander. Admiral Messon has updated the count. Approximately 4,800 confirmed aboard, 4,800, out of a colony population that had been before the Veth erasure began over 90,000. The numbers sat in her chest like a stone. She breathed around them. How many more in the shelters? Estimates suggest another 2,000 in the deepest subsurface sections. Access is compromised. The extraction teams are... A pause. The comms officer was young. He was learning in real time that military communications required you to report things you did not want to report. They're still trying, Commander. She looked at the tactical display. The Veth engagement had not stopped. The faster ships were holding, and they were holding at a cost that the display was updating with the relentless honesty of systems that did not feel the weight of what they were reporting. She looked at the names, the designations. The vessels she had served on or alongside, or simply known as presences in the fleet roster for years. She made a decision. Get me the Veth command frequency. The bridge went very quiet. Commander, the comms officer said. The command frequency, open it. The channel opened. There was a quality to the silence on the other end of it that was different from ordinary comm silence. It had a texture. She had never spoken to a Veth commander before. She had never needed to. This is Commander Yale Droz of the Earth Consolidated Defense Fleet aboard the Amaranth's Edge, she said. Her voice was steady. The injury in her side was a steady counterpoint to it. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I'm telling you because it's operationally relevant to both of us, not as a negotiating position. Silence. There are approximately 2,000 Halen civilians in the deepest subsurface sections of the third planet's primary colony. Our extraction teams cannot reach them without additional time. I am asking for a cessation of active engagement for 90 minutes. The silence stretched. Then a voice translated through the conclave's real-time matrix, flattened by the translation process but carrying something that the matrix's emotional inflection algorithms flagged as elevated processing state, said, "You are requesting a tactical pause that benefits only your position." "No," Yale said. "I'm requesting a tactical pause that benefits 2,000 people who aren't involved in your territorial objectives." Another silence, longer this time. "Your fleet is at approximately 52% effective capacity," the Veth commander said. "You cannot sustain current engagement parameters beyond 3 hours. Why are you not withdrawing?" Yale looked at the display, at the names on it, at the transports near the third planet. At the medical officer standing beside her command chair with an expression that had moved, over the past 6 hours, from professional competence to something quieter and more complicated. "Because they're still down there," she said. The silence that followed was the longest yet. What precision a form in silence was experiencing in that silence was something her species did not have a clean category for. She was running the same calculations she always ran. She was processing the same inputs she always processed. But the outputs were not producing the expected results because one of the variables, the human commander, her motivation, the underlying logic of her behavior, was not behaving like a variable. It was behaving like a constant, a fixed point that did not move regardless of what the other values in the equation did. Every civilization the Veth had ever encountered treated survival as a variable, as the dependent variable. The thing whose value was determined by all the other factors, the thing you solved for. The humans appeared to have decided that survival was not what they were solving for. She did not grant the 90 minutes. She did something stranger than that. She ordered a repositioning of her forward elements, not a withdrawal, not a tactical retreat that could be read as weakness in the formal records, but a repositioning, a shift in the engagement geometry that opened a window in the coverage pattern over the third planet's subsurface access points. She did not explain this order to her staff. She filed it under a tactical designation that translated as resource optimization. Later, reviewing the records, the conclave's analysts would note the gap in coverage. They would run models trying to determine whether it was intentional. They would conclude, eventually, that it was. They would spend considerably longer trying to determine what had caused it. The evacuation of the last subsurface section took 104 minutes. The extraction teams, 3 units, working in atmospheric conditions that made every movement a calculation and every minute a negotiation with the structural integrity of tunnels that had not been designed for military use, brought out 1,812 survivors. The rest of the shelters had failed. The teams knew this before they went in. They went in anyway. Admiral Messon covered the final transports with what remained of the fast attack formation. He was aware, in the way that people are aware of things they have already made peace with, that the covering action required a positioning that made extraction from that position extremely unlikely. He had made this calculation before. He had made it at the beginning. He was simply arriving now at the place the calculation had always pointed. He thought about his daughters. He thought about the opt-out provision. He thought about the way his bridge crew had looked when he said make it mean something, and the way they had immediately understood exactly what he meant, and how that understanding had moved through them not as fear but as something harder and quieter and more permanent. He thought about the fact that no one had had to explain it to any of them. The undying promise covered the transports. The transports cleared the system boundary. The Veth engagement resumed. Messon's final transmission was received by Vainsarad at the Conclave monitoring station, who was still at her post and who had stopped trying to categorize what she was witnessing and had simply begun watching with the full weight of her attention. It was a standard fleet communication, formatted correctly, addressed to ECDF Command and the Conclave monitoring station simultaneously. It contained the final operational status report of the Halen rescue operation. Casualties. Survivors extracted. Equipment lost. System status. It ended with a single additional line that was not standard format and that the Conclave's archivists would later annotate as informal addendum personal notation. We got most of them out, that's enough. Vainsarad sat in the monitoring station for a long time after the last signals died. The Veth had withdrawn from the Halen system 40 minutes after the final transport cleared. They had filed no formal justification. Their ambassador to the Conclave had, in the session convened to address the situation, said very little, and what she had said was characterized by the Drassian diplomatic analysts as consistent with an entity processing information that does not fit its existing interpretive frameworks. The Conclave session had been contentious. There were members who wanted to classify the human intervention as a violation of Conclave military protocols, the unauthorized deployment into a system with active territorial dispute, the engagement with a Conclave member species without formal authorization, the implications for the Conclave's collective security architecture. These were legitimate procedural concerns. They were raised by legitimate procedural voices. They were largely drowned out by the members who were looking at the survivor numbers and the casualty numbers and trying to perform a calculation that kept coming out wrong. 6% survival probability, documented, official. The actual survival rate had been approximately 7.3%, which was not dramatically different, which was not a statistic that rewrote history, which was not a number that, on its own, explained why 3 separate non-human representatives had left the session chamber before it concluded, and why one of them had been observed standing in the corridor outside for 20 minutes, very still, in the way of an entity that has had something fundamental updated. Vainsarad had not attended the session. She had filed her monitoring report and had gone, for the first time in several days, to sleep. She dreamed, in the way her species dreamed, in abstractions rather than images, about the gap in the Veth coverage pattern, the window that had opened over the subsurface access points. She dreamed about a Veth commander running calculations that weren't producing expected outputs, and about what it meant to encounter something that violated expected logic not through superior capability but through a complete absence of the ceiling that logic imposed. She woke up thinking about the word constant. The way a variable moved when you changed other values, the way a constant did not. She had spent her career in diplomatic work that was, at its core, the work of predicting how other civilizations would behave when pressure was applied. Every civilization she had ever studied was predictable in the same foundational way. Apply enough pressure and the survival instinct would redirect their behavior. This was not a weakness. It was a universal. It was so universal that it had never needed to be explicitly stated. It was simply the water everything else swam in. She opened her research archive and began going through the records of every documented human military engagement in the Conclave era. She had never done this systematically before. There had never been a reason to. She read for 9 hours. At the end of 9 hours, she wrote a report that she addressed to the full Conclave Strategic Council. The report was 43 pages long. Its conclusions were careful, heavily qualified, supported by extensive citation. The abstract, which she wrote last, was 6 sentences. The 6th sentence read, "The human species does not appear to have an upper pressure threshold at which survival instinct overrides mission commitment. In every documented case, including cases where mission success was statistically impossible at the time of commitment, human actors continued to operate as though the mission objective was achievable. This is not irrationality. This is a different kind of rationality, one that does not treat self-preservation as the foundational variable from which all other calculations derive. The galaxy should understand clearly what this means. It means that humanity cannot be deterred by threatening what every other civilization holds most sacred, their own continuation. She filed the report. She sat with what she had written. She thought about Commander Droz on the Veth command frequency, injured and exhausted and steady, saying because they're still down there as though that were a complete explanation. As though that were the only thing that needed to be said. She thought about Admiral Messon's final transmission. We got most of them out, that's enough. The Halen survivors were being processed by Conclave Humanitarian Infrastructure, 1,812 of them from the subsurface shelters. Thousands more from the earlier extraction waves, people who had been, by every official calculation, already lost. Someone had decided that official calculations were a starting point, not a conclusion. Someone had looked at 6% and said, then we begin there. Months later, a Halen child, a species that reproduced in clusters and who, in their culture, named children after the things that had been present at the moment of their emergence into the world, was recorded in a conclave resettlement facility. The facility worker completing intake documentation asked for the child's name. The child's name in Halen translated to burning. The worker asked about it. The child's surviving parent, who had been in one of the subsurface shelters, explained that the child had been born in the final hours before the extraction, that they had been in the darkness in the failing air with the shelters beginning to go, that the first thing the child had seen through the emergency viewport was the light of weapons fire in the sky above them, not the Veth fire. They would have known the difference, the parent said. They had seen enough Veth fire by then, the other fire. Fire that was moving wrong, that was too aggressive, too reckless, that was driving itself into the geometry of the engagement rather than out of it. The fire of ships that were choosing to be the most dangerous thing in the sky regardless of what it cost them. The fire that was buying time. The conclave worker wrote the name into the record. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the resettlement form in front of her, which asked for species of record, planet of origin, and rescue authorization code. The rescue authorization code was a ECDF deployment number that traced back to a human fleet command decision made in a briefing room 12 hours before the operation began. She typed it in and watched the system process it, and the green confirmation light came on the way it always did, and the record was complete. She sat with it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Somewhere across the galaxy, the rebuilt Halen colony was beginning its first new structures on a conclave-approved resettlement world. Somewhere, Vane Sarat's report was being discussed in rooms that would take years to reach conclusions. Somewhere, a Veth Strategic Intelligence Division was filing an assessment of the Halen engagement that would be classified at the highest level and reviewed by only the most senior commanders, an assessment that contained, buried in its technical language and its careful calibrations, a single admission that no Veth strategic document had ever contained before. The admission was this: we do not yet have a model that accurately predicts human behavior under conditions of maximum pressure. Further observation required. And somewhere, in a military hospital on a Station 3 systems from where it had all happened, a woman with a healing injury in her left side sat up late reading reports and responding to transmissions, and doing the administrative work that follows any operation, and thinking in the quiet moments between one task and the next, about the names on a tactical display that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, and about whether the carrying of them was a kind of debt or a kind of promise. And concluding, as she always concluded, that it was probably both, and that the weight of it was simply what you accepted when you decided that the people still down there were the calculation you were running. The galaxy had asked for salvation. The humans had given them fire. What the galaxy had not understood, and was only now beginning to, slowly, uncomfortably in the way of a realization that could not be rushed, was that for humanity these had never been different things: salvation and fire. Fire and cost and continuation. The conclave would debate the Halen intervention for years. They would write policies and protocols and formal frameworks for managing what they were increasingly calling the human variable. They would use the word variable carefully and correctly because it was the accurate word, because a variable was something that changed in response to input. But late at night, in the private communications and the off-record conversations and the quiet moments that followed long sessions of official deliberation, the word some of them were reaching for was different. The word was constant, something that does not move. That does not change its value when you change everything around it. That remains precisely what it is, regardless of what the equation demands, regardless of how catastrophic the output becomes. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years believing that every civilization under enough pressure would eventually solve for survival. What they were learning, slowly and with the particular discomfort of revising something foundational, was that there was at least one civilization in the known galaxy that had looked at that equation and decided to solve for something else. And that they had been solving for it, quietly, without announcement or declaration, in briefing rooms and opt-out provisions and final transmissions, and the specific silence of people who understand exactly what they are doing and have already made their peace with it, for longer than anyone had thought to look. The child named Burning grew up on a conclave resettlement world, speaking Heylan and 3 other languages, and knew almost nothing about the humans specifically. Knew only the story the parent told, the darkness, the failing air, the fire above that was moving wrong, the fire that was choosing to be where it was, the fire that stayed.